Hello and welcome to the 230th episode of the Board Game Barrage podcast, a podcast about board games, the latest hotness, and how to have fun with your friends, even when you're losing. I am Kellen, the red tank, joined by Neelan and Mark, the orange and green tank. This is the part where you say hello, friends.
Hello, friends.
It is early in the morning. We are trying a different record time, so let's see what kind of energy we get at 8:30 a.m.
We have made a mistake.
We had to get Mark out of his bed. We called him, and then we came over and nudged him.
And then they realized I was still in the casino and was not home.
Today on the Board Game Barrage podcast, we're going to be telling you about the board games that we have played this week and then answering a hot question. And that question is, when are heavy games worth it?
Oh,
Dramatic pause. No, Mark.
Spoiler.
Do you understand how a dramatic pause works?
Yeah, but
First of all, it starts you don't say dramatic pause. So let us get to the games we have played. Mark is going to talk to us about how to have fun with his friends even when he's losing in a game of Barony. I'm going to be talking to us about board games, Bausack, and Whitehall Mystery. And Neelan is going to be talking to us about the latest hotness, Dead Reckoning. Mark, why don't you kick us off with your losing play of Barony?
In fact, this was a winning play of Barony, and the logs say so. And if the logs say so, then it's truth. We
weren't there, so...
Well, yeah, but all we have to go on is the record, the written record.
Your friends were there.
They were my true friends, the ones who vouched for me for winning that game of Barony, and not assume immediately that I lost it, which is a sad state of affairs, Kellen, if I have to say this publicly. But anyhow, I got a chance to play Barony by Mark Andre and printed by Matago. I have to shout out, among a lot of people, the board game snobs here, because they've been talking about Barony for a long, long time. I think it's been on their top 10 lists a couple times over the years. But in general, Barony has been a very highly rated, critically acclaimed, but not super popular game that I've been trying to play for a while. Mark Andre, obviously the designer of Splendor, and I was looking information about him up after playing this game and trying to get more info on it, and his father, I guess, pushed him into playing chess as a kid, and it sort of shows in Barony. There's a lot of chess-like aspects in it. In Barony, you'll have a variable board made up of a number of hexagons that represent different types of terrain, and what you're trying to do is it's an area control game, but with a racing aspect. You have a number of different types of pieces. There are cities and strongholds and villages and knights. And knights are the one mobile unit you have and the unit that you'll use to spread around the board and to accomplish your goals. You'll start the game with 3 cities. Your goals will be to build your 2 remaining cities and to increase your nobility title. So those are the 2 sort of avenues of scoring in the game. And the game will end once you have upgraded your nobility title 3 times. The way you build cities, to sort of backtrack a little bit, is to get your knight into a spot on the board, to use the construction action to make the knight into a village, and then later you can construct your village up into a city. While you have villages on the board, they are vulnerable, so that's something to take account on. And the vulnerability of the cities goes along with one of the main aspects of the game, which is a tempo consideration. While I was playing this, I felt a lot of Blue Lagoon vibes. There's a lot of, I need to get to a spot. I'm worried about somebody getting to a spot. Do I want to use an action now to try to ensure that I get to the spot that I need to? Or do I put that off and try to maximize my situation in other places? So again, to talk about the ways to win, one will be building their cities in the manner I've just described. And the other one, as I said, is to get these nobility titles. This is basically acquiring resources from the board and then cashing them in to move up on this nobility track. Now, the thing that's sort of interesting about this is you need 15 points of resources in order to gain enough points to move up the nobility track. The various types of terrain on the board will yield different number of resource points. So the fields yield 5 resource points all the way down to, I think, the mountains yield 2. So if you can build 3 villages and fields and then get the resources from them, you'll have enough points just in that go to raise your nobility title. However, this is sort of where attacking comes in, because if you are ever defeated in battle and you have a resource token, you are forced to give one to your opponent. And all battles in this game, which sort of, this is recalling sort of the chess-like aspect of this game, all battles of the game are deterministic. There's no dice rolling, and they're very simple to calculate. Any hex can have one unit from each player coexist. However, if there are ever 2 units or a second unit is moved into a spot, that army wins the battle. So, for example, if I have 2 units in a spot and then anybody tries to move in a unit into that spot, they will automatically lose. So in effect, if you have 2 units in a hex, it is now yours and impassable. And then the other example would be if somebody has a unit in a spot and I move 2 units into a spot, then I would win immediately. And movement in this game is very small. If you take the movement action, each of your knights can move one spot and one spot only. And so you cannot surprise somebody with some big movement action and then take over spaces on the board. It's, again, very tactical, very chess-like in that regard.
Quick question. Are those like lone knights in that situation defeated, or do they just retreat? Or
they are defeated and taken off the board. Okay. And then again, if a village is defeated in that way, then you lose one of the resources that you have. And resources are really tough to come by in this game. So this is another timing thing, because you want to take the action to gain resources just before cashing them in to move your nobility rank up, because if you try to sit on resources, then all your villages become targets and people will come in unless you have them all defended, and you're very piece limited in this game, and so you only have 7 knights in the entire game and you can't defend on all fronts. And even if you did successfully, you're giving up so much attacking tempo or so much tempo to actually score points and move up in this game that it's a big sacrifice. Anyhow, those are the 2 things you're trying to do. Again, as long as you move up the nobility track 3 times, that's all you need to do, and that will end the game. And basically, that's all there is to Barony. As I sort of mentioned, this is a game with very few rules. There are 5 actions you can take on your turn, and even those, a lot of them are just cashing in points. They're very simple. Again, as I mentioned, the movement rules are very simple. There's one thing you can do that sort of reminded me of the action you mentioned in Homeworlds last week. The big, what was that action? The big, like...
Sacrifice something to do multiple actions.
So there's an equivalent here. Moving your knights around Barony, you have to take a movement action and you move 1 space. And so to move a knight from one side of the board to the other side is nigh on impossible. There's an action you could do, which is to sacrifice 1 knight out of the game to create a knight on any spot on the edge of the board that you want. So it's a sort of like a sudden strike, whereas most of this game is very, calculable and you're not going to surprise anybody. This is that one move that sort of throws a wrench in where people might not have been expecting it.
All right, I have questions because I'm excited about the game. It's been in my shelf of shame for like multiple years.
Yeah.
You said twice now, and we're going to put this as a quote on the box. Feel free, Madigo, to use this. Mark Basada, there are no surprises in this game.
Right.
That's what I would put really big, and I would actually make that bigger than the designer's name and Barony's name. There are no surprises in this game.
Yeah.
It feels like you're having a little bit of trouble describing whether it's an abstract or whether it's like more thematic, or at least the way the sort of the way that it looks, its presentation and what it's saying it is. Kind of even similar to Homeworlds in that respect. Do you feel like Molly, who hates abstract strategy games, could like Barony?
Could. But if you...
Would or could?
I mean,
Let's
it depends.
Be declarative, Mark, like you were earlier on. This game has no surprises.
Sure. Well, I'm immediately going to back off of that and say it depends on what you require for a game to be thematic. I would say that if you are strongly against abstract games, you probably will not want to get into Barony, because the theme, it sort of makes sense, but for the most part, it's pasted on. It's like, if you will accept it, if you realize this is an abstract game, but you want a little flavor and you're willing to buy into it, it works fine. This is the same designer as Splendor, which is a game I think works despite it being an abstract game. We play Splendor differently. I know you bring out all the jewels when you ever play Splendor and really get into the roles. But yes, that could potentially be a stumbling block. I think if you're a fan of abstract games, you're going to like this. If you are a fan of chess, even though that's 100% not a requirement, I don't want to say that or call out chess and make that a qualifier, because this has a lot of things that are similar to chess, but mostly there's a lot of differences. You're not going to be having the sort of pitfalls of chess that I think turn off a lot of people. But it is a game that does reward tempo considerations and trying to plan on the fly. So I enjoyed Barony quite a bit. We've all played it a couple times, and in reading more about it, I have been reading that the sorcery expansion, people are saying, is a must, which is something that I did not play with, but I'd be certainly interested in learning more about that. So, yeah, I would certainly recommend Barony by Mark, Andre, and Madigo.
Is it a hidden gem, Mark?
I think so. I don't think a lot of people talk about Barony. I don't think it's had any reprints recently, and it's a game that I have a hard time thinking that I would ever really grow wary of. Again, it's just like, it's so tactical and short, tactical and short, that it's going to feel, I think, different depending on which group you play with. I can see games of this being very cutthroat. I can see games as being very turtley, and I think that whatever strategy somebody uses feels like there'd be a way to counter it. So a lot of different ways to play it.
One of my biggest concerns after listening to all this is just that you haven't recommended it more to me. This feels like something I would really like based on the length and sort of what you're doing, area control fightiness of it, but you haven't uttered the phrase, Kellen, I think you would really like this. I'm being totally serious.
No,
I'm laughing, but I have a quizzical thought in my brain. Like, why are you not?
Yeah. And the thing is, I feel like I already knew that you had this game and had not played it. I think we talked about it in the past, about a game that we both wanted to play. And so I had that in my mind when I played it. But I don't know. I think you'll like this. I just don't know if it's going to be a slam dunk for you. I think it's a little... I don't know. You don't strike me as somebody who necessarily loves abstract games, and it might be a little too abstract. Like, I think you'll enjoy it fine. I just don't know if it'll grab your attention and be like a game that you will definitely want to hold on to.
I sometimes wonder, because I feel like Kellen not surprises me, but Kellen seems to have more love for abstracts than I do. And I think as soon as you're like threading the needle between, is this more Go or is this more Blue Lagoon, where it falls on that spectrum is like very important to me.
Yeah.
And like that, I'm now wondering if this should be something I should take a look at.
Yeah, this is more Blue Lagoon than Go. This is not as abstract as Go. You're getting resources, you're advancing pieces up a tech tree, for lack of a better term. So yeah, this is a little bit more to that. And, there are a number of pieces in this. There's a number of different buildings, stuff like that, but they are really simple to understand, and they make a lot of sense just even upon explaining them. For example, there's a building called the Stronghold, and
it's strong.
It's strong. It is impassable. It makes it sort of an impassable spot on the board. And another thing that's sort of interesting is the way that this modular board is set up randomly before every game will also really affect how the game is played, because you draft spots for your initial castles, and this is something I didn't realize in the first game, and then the second game became more apparent that there are spots because, for example, lakes are impassable. So you start to see, okay, here's a little bottleneck here. If I can make a little set of buildings here, then maybe I can set up a stronghold and make it so that if people want to attack me, they have to go through these like bottleneck areas, which make it more difficult. Yeah.
Mark, you got to stop talking so that I can do an interlude about Bausack.
Do it.
My favorite game to say the name of.
Right. Go for it.
All right. Now it's time to talk about Bausack. This is a game from 1987, so we are going back away from the latest hotness. This is sort of the daddy of stacking games. It is very hard to talk about, and we won't spend too much time talking about it because there's no real defined rule set. Similar to Junk Art, which has a bunch of mini games within it, Bausack comes with a bunch of different rule sets. And then if you go on BGG, everyone's like, actually don't play by any of those rule sets, play by this rule set. So it really, truly, it is a giant bag or box of shapes that are in...
Sack was there.
A giant sack. Yes, thank you. A giant Bausack. It could be my Bausack. There are a lot of ways to say this. And those shapes are really, really varied to like Christmas tree, a semicircle, like a bowl, what looks to be like a poop emoji, again from 1987, so I don't know how that's the case.
Prescient.
Like a wizard, like it literally has a golf tee. Like literally they went to the local golf course, took one of the tees and spray painted it into the color scheme. It's in the bag. Yeah. It's all in the bag, right? It's all in Bausack.
In the sack.
Right? In the sack, Bausack. Yeah. Actually, the version that I have, is the red and black edition called Sac Noir.
Ooh.
Which, yeah, that has some cachet to it, Sac Noir. And this was lovingly gifted to me by a member of the Discord, Second of the New. Thank you for sending it to me. We had a lovely time playing it. But that's not all, okay? The victory points, or the currency in the game, Mark, I'm not lying to you. Neelan is already laughing, okay?
Sack points.
No, it is a sack of actual beans. Literal beans that you could cook. Okay. And that comes with the game, right? So it's like literally everything that you could find at a hardware store.
Right.
You know, and then a sack of beans.
Yeah.
That's the game. So the game of Bausack that we played was one of the ones online that was recommended to me, and it was great. It was ultra simple. It was everyone plays a piece to form a foundation, and then the rest of the game is you pick up a piece and you say, I think I can place this on the tower. And then the person to your left gets to call or not. If they call you have to place it, and then you score a point if you place it, and they score a point if you don't. Or they can play the sort of, not martyr, they could play the champion and take the piece from you, and then they have to place it. And if they place it, no one scores a point, and if they don't place it, you score a point. So there's a lot of like, is this person just trying to egg me on with this piece that they've picked up? Like, there's no way anyone can place this. I emerged victorious, obviously, because it's my sack noir, my Bausack, and not for any other reason that Nealon might be about to bring up.
Yeah. This had nothing to do with Brandon to your left failing spectacularly to put flat shapes onto the stack.
Yes, it is. Again, like stacking games all devolve into the same thing. And, you know, we've seen games like Meeple Circus try to add like a theme to that and add sort of like a arc to it. We've had Junk Art, which tries to stack sets of mini games and sort of sets. I'm excited to continue to bring out Bausack because I think I can do so with my family, and I think I can try some of these different variants. I want to try some of the ones in the rule book, which includes like a no thanks style, like you have to bid to not take a piece and place it on your own tower. But there's sort of some games where you're stacking your tower as high as you can versus doing a shared structure. Again, it's more of basically a sack of blocks that says Sack Noir on it or Bausack. So if that's what you're into, that's what you're into, and you should seek this out. It's an old game, but it is by some considered still to be the best dexterity game, which is why I've always wanted to seek it out.
This sounds like you've already called out this game, but it feels a lot like Junk Art.
Yes. Junk Art stole shamelessly from Bausack. And on the face of it, right, the marketing, it's much easier to market Junk Art than to sort of get Bausack out into the public, which is what we're trying to do by saying the word Bausack as many times as we can. I literally did on a previous episode brought up Bausack.
Did? Yeah, that was a memorable call out. I think the marketing should lead more on the sack of beans. I haven't heard anything about the sack of beans until you just mentioned it.
Well, and that's how you keep track of the points. So every time Brandon up, I got a bean from the bag of beans, and then I won the game. Another game we got to play was Whitehall Mystery, which I believe is the most streamlined version, reimplementation of Letters from Whitechapel. And this is a hidden movement game. If you're not familiar, it's typically one versus all, where one player is playing Jack the Ripper, and the rest of the team is playing investigators, trying to capture him. There are many popular games in this hidden movement genre, including Spectre Ops, including Fury of Dracula, including Mind Management. Does that count, Nealon? I've not played Mind Management.
I think it's very much in the same thing. I think Scotland Yard is a very close comparison too.
Yes. I hate hidden movement games. I hate cooperative games. And I very much enjoyed my play of Whitehall Mystery. And I think that that's the TLDR. It's essentially, there's so little going on here. Okay, Jack the Ripper at the start of the game identifies 4 locations, one in each quadrant that he will get to before he gets caught, and he starts the game on one of those quadrants, and the race is on. He has 15 moves with which to get to another one of those spaces, or he automatically loses. Then he also loses if he gets caught. And the investigators are moving on a different track, sort of, than he is. He's moving on circles, they're moving on squares, trying to block him off and then capture him. One of the greatest tensions in the game is that the investigators have to choose between looking for clues where he has been or could be all around them in every adjacent circle, or choosing to try to capture him on one specific circle. And so it's always like, oh, I think we actually might know he's right there, but we're not going to get as much information if I blindly start grabbing or trying to murder him. I affectionately referred to it as murdering him, so unfortunately I was not a very good investigator. I do think that a lot of my enjoyment of this honest to God, came from having Neelan on my team, because Neelan became the big brains, and I was sort of the instinctual leader, right, that everyone sort of went to with, like, where could this criminal be? And so Neelan, I would be like, define the parameters, and then he would do his math like a mentat. He would be like, boop, 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 0 to 4 moves, and then I would be like, oh, and I would use my skills, my courage, bravery, and sort of leadership to ascertain where he might be. Now, one could say that that's not what happened, because I blindly stabbed like 7 places, and then Neelan did it one time and caught him. So he stole my thunder there a little bit, but the best team captain sort of let everyone on the team get a win,
right?
Which is what happened in our play of Whitehall Mystery.
You were like Michael Jordan. Like, Michael Jordan could always score, but he knew he had to like distribute to get people's...
I think that Michael Jordan might be underselling me just a little bit in this game of Whitehall Mystery. But if we have to...
Yeah. Something for the layperson to sort of understand, even though it's certainly not one-to-one.
Thank you for saying that, Mark.
Yeah.
Neelan, you like this, right?
Yeah, I like this a lot. I had previously played Letters from Whitechapel, but a very long time ago. So to be perfectly honest, I don't remember exactly how this differs and where it streamlines. But this felt like, if I had not recently played Mind Management, I would say this is probably the best hidden movement game I have played to date. I think Mind Management still takes it for me, but this was so fairly easy to explain. Had a lot of just the exact right tensions you want. When Jack the Ripper is like able to slip away, it never feels unfair. It's just like, oh man, we missed this alley that he ducked down. It feels fun. And the visual component of the map makes a huge difference, because there are these connections between routes where it's like, okay, this one is visually far away, so is that the thing that someone would try to do to like psych you out, or like vice versa? So like you're playing both with the visual representation of the map as well as the actual logical connection of points. It's good. I think like the timing aspect of like Jack having to get from place to place within 15 moves adds this very cool like up and down tempo to the game, which was good.
And we played with a very smart Jack the Ripper, and not the same person who couldn't stack flat objects on other flat objects. This was a very intelligent person that we managed to overcome. So that was our play of Whitehall Mysteries. One that, like, if I liked hidden movement even 10% more, I would consider picking up. It's so lean. It is so lean. They did such a good job. Wow. And does dovetail nicely into our feature topic, which would be great here, except we're not dovetailing into our feature topic. We're having Neelan talk about the latest hotness, Dead Reckoning. Neelan, start talking.
Well, I think this does dovetail into our feature topic a little bit. I'm going to be talking about Dead Reckoning by John D. Clare. This is the latest and greatest in an attempt to make card crafting a thing, which is, I think, John has tried to do multiple times with multiple games. I don't think has ever quite hit for me. Mystic Vale being the purest version of this, which is just a deck builder. Dead Reckoning takes the deck building aspects of Mystic Vale, where if you're not familiar with what card crafting is, you have a card that's inside a transparent sleeve, and you're adding to that card by sliding transparencies effectively into that card. So that card gets physically thicker and thicker as you sort of add icons to it, effectively increasing its ability to do things over time. Now, in the game of Dead Reckoning, you're playing as pirates. Each of the cards that you have in your hand represents like one of those members of the crew. And they are getting these transparencies in them over time, which you acquire from the board in order to improve their abilities. Like at the start of the game, if I play my crew member, they're only able to like load one cargo onto the dock. But down the line, once we're getting close to the end, that crew member is now raising my sails and firing a cannon and loading cargo onto a dock and doing all these myriad things. And that's, I think, the fun of the system, is seeing all these things enhance and grow. So what you're doing in the game of Dead Reckoning is trying to get as much treasure as possible. You are pirates. There's a map of all these islands, which is sort of randomly generated at the start of the game. Most of them are face down. On your turn, you're taking the sort of typical actions you might expect. You can raise your sails to move. You can load cargo on and off of islands. You can establish little outposts on these islands, which will either increase how much resources they produce, how defensive they are, etc. You're fighting other players. You can get into these ship battles with them. Ultimately, what you're trying to do is get a lot of coins, get them back to your chest at the dock before the game ends, which I think is probably one of the most interesting aspects about this, which is the game timing. Now, this borrows pretty heavily from Scythe, and to be fair to the designer, this is very kindly acknowledged in the front of the rulebook. This uses Scythe's achievement system to determine the end of the game. That means that there are a selection of different actions you can take. Sinking a ship, winning battles, getting amounts of money, spending cargo, all the things that tie into all of the things that you can do in the game. And when you've accomplished 4 of these achievements, for example, if I built 5 buildings or won 4 battles, each time I get a little achievement flag. When someone has 4 of them, the game ends and you tally up all of your coins. But each of those achievements is also worth coins, so there's a very cool tension between, do I go for the achievements that are going to get me a lot of coins, or do I go for the easy achievements that don't get me as many coins, but might get me to finish the game quicker? Because if you're familiar with Scythe, that's kind of one of the key tensions of the game. The person that finishes the game is not always the winner, but evaluating when you're in the right position to end the game and win is what it all boils down to. So I think understandably this has been compared to Scythe a lot. I don't think that's fair for a couple of reasons. I feel like this feels pretty different in terms of the experience of it. It's a lot sillier. It's a lot more bombastic. The battle system is, for lack of a better word, ridiculous. You're just taking a bunch of cubes, dropping them onto this board. They spill out over this mess of icons that are like, you are closer to winning the battle. You did some damage to the other ship. You get some cargo. So all these things happen over the course of battle that are just like the result of this smattering of cubes spilling across the battle board. And then sometimes your ship sinks and you have to give coins to the other player. You know, it's that sort of very fun, feisty, bombastic game. It is a lot different from like how dry and procedural and deterministic Scythe can feel.
I think Dead Reckoning, right, is much more of a sandbox than Scythe, which feels much more honed into like an engine builder that's going to end in 20 turns. Is that kind of the difference you're highlighting?
I think that's exactly it. The way I'd like to describe Scythe to most people, we say it a lot of times on the podcast, it's more of an efficiency puzzle. Like it's like doing the optimal amount of stuff in a very limited number of actions. Dead Reckoning does feel more like a sandbox. It has a little bit more of an open-ended nature. I could go fighty, I could go explory, I could get all of these things. And then it's a little bit more futsy and point salady as to like who is going to win at the end of the game. But that's it. I loved it. It's not tickling the same thing in my brain as Scythe is. But for this sort of kind of sillier, more maybe a little bit more random combat in a type of game, I thought this was a lot of fun. All the times that I played this now, the ability to explore the different aspects of your crew, because they're all themed around each of the different things you can take, right? There's one crew member who only exists to build buildings. There's one crew member who only exists to upgrade your ship. And leveling up those crew members and making them better and better and exploring all of the ways that you can do that is part of the fun of the exploration of this game. Oh, this game, I'm going to make my purser level 4 so that I have these 6 ship upgrades that no one else does. That's the fun of it to me.
Yeah, it struck me because we took a look at the prototype of Dead Reckoning while it was on Kickstarter or prior to Kickstarter, and I just remember thinking, this is not exactly the game for me, but I still really enjoyed it, and there's so many fun elements and systems within it where it's like fun to upgrade your cards, it's fun to participate in combat, it's like fun to try to race to get some of these achievements. It just was joyous, and so I'm glad to hear that you went in on the Kickstarter as a result of me, first of all, you know, maybe John Declare second, and have had such a great time with it. I'd like to play this with you because Christina and I played it as a 2-player, and so I'd like to see it at that 3-player count, and even 4. Mark, maybe. I don't know. Maybe we could invite Mark.
Yeah, no, I think I'm happy to have it in my collection. I think it's something that like occupies a different space to Scythe. And there are just like so many fun little systems in this that like I think are just really solid. Like your victory points take up space on the cargo of your ship. So like you're balancing that between like, do I have enough space to carry my victory points back to the harbor versus like the cargo I have to spend to like get upgrades. There are some cool like exploratory stuff baked into, like if I go deeper down the ocean, the upgrades get better and better and better. So like how far do I want to go to get the good stuff? It's just got a lot of really fun systems, a lot of big space to explore. There are so many little transparencies and abilities in those decks that I've not seen half of them at this point, you know? So I'm definitely excited to play more Dead Reckoning. Very cool game and very, very good production as well.
Yeah, and it's just exciting because it like on Kickstarter could look like the kitchen sink sort of, it's got everything in it, but to know that it's more honed and more of a complete experience is really cool.
It's definitely smarter than it looks in terms of some of the design elements. I guess I will say one quick thing, which is that if you are not okay with the idea of haha random, drop some cubes and maybe I will sink and maybe I won't, then that's exactly what this game is. And you ought to know that going in. But as long as you're okay to roll with those punches when they happen and revel in the fun and the silliness of it, I think you'll have a great time with Dead Reckoning. That is Dead Reckoning by Alderac and John D. Clare.
All right. And now we're going to talk about today's hot question, which is, when is board game heaviness justified? So heaviness as defined by how complicated, how complex a game is, and justified as defined by if we like it, if it's worth it. Now that we've set the table with all of our terminology, which
Webster's Dictionary,
everyone wants to fight about, what are you guys' opening thoughts when you think about this?
When I think about heaviness in board games, it comes down to sort of two forks. One is basically like rule sets, how many rules, how many edge cases there are. In some ways, it boils down to just the volume of rules, just how much of a rule load do I have to take on in order to play the game. The other aspect of heaviness would be just how considered I have to be in playing the game, how brain burnery, to use some board game shorthand, is the game. So those are the two sort of main lines when it comes to heaviness for me.
But wait, Mark, a fork has 3 prongs on it traditionally in America. Well, I think that you're revealing yourself to be pretty ignorant right now. I would say that for me, the third prong of the fork is game length. Yes. Not everyone will agree with me on that, but I do think that games that are long are just inherently heavier, and not by function of the other two. It's just people are going to disagree on that. But for me, that is another component of it.
But no, I agree with that. At least it's a consideration when it comes to figuring out how heavy a game is. I would say like a game that lasted 2.5 hours or longer and you called it light, you'd have to really convince me of that.
Right. And at least now you have, a fully functioning fork.
Yeah. I've been wondering why all that salad was dropping off of my fork, and now I know I'm 1/3 down on prongs, so that's a problem.
I keep thinking about something that Christina said, I think, during the bonus episode about diplomacy, right? Which is that is a heavy game by virtue of the fact that it's taxing for a long period of time, right? Even though it doesn't have a traditionally like heavy rule set or that much like complexity to it, that's definitely something I would think of as, oh yeah, I'm not just going to willy-nilly go into a game of diplomacy. There has to be a frame of mind that is like prepping me for that experience.
Sociopath.
Yes. But yeah, to roll into the way I think about this, it's like three slightly different prongs to the fork, if you will, which is
non-American
fork. Yeah, to my European fork, which is like broadly, is this offering an experience that I can't get from a lighter game? But like specifically, sometimes I think that's derived from like strategic depth, right? A light game is light because it is a little bit more frivolous. It might be a very strategic game, but you can kind of just go into it without having to burn your brain over it. Whereas sometimes a heavy game just offers you the ability to exercise your brain in different ways. Second, if it is a very big experiential game, like a game that is like something like a diplomacy, like a once every couple of months type experience. And then the third thing, which I think is something that is maybe unique to me, is when heaviness affords you the ability to like visit a theme more effectively. I sometimes think about, and this is not normally a compliment to some of these games, but some of the most typical thematic games tend to be like, oh, and you can go hunting, and you can do this, and you can do that, and you can do that, because that's all the things that like, I don't know, Geralt of Rivia could do in The Witcher video games, like no shade towards the Witcher board game. I've never played it, but that was just like a dumb example I came with off the top of my head. But it's like the opportunity to be like, oh, this is that thing I could do in the video game. And to me, some of that comes at the cost of simplicity. Like you cannot do all of these things that are like thematically meaningful unless they're like baked into the rule set.
And so are you saying, and I'm trying to put words in your mouth, which I never do, that's separate from just the amount of rules, right? So there's an amount of rules, and then what you're saying is sort of the thematic, like I'm sitting in a moment and pondering what I can do, and I could go to the forest, I could go to the river, I could, is that separate from just straight length of rules, or is that the same but different?
Well, so the reason in my head is like disconnected, right? Because like when I think about War of the Ring 2nd edition, which is maybe a good example of this, where I think some of the heaviness lies is that you'll kind of evaluate everything in the context of how this went in terms of the books and the films, right? There's almost like the rule set to the game, but then there's also like you're measuring that and comparing that and contrasting that against what your idea of what the theme should allow you to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
It's an aspect of heaviness that I'd never considered, but now it strikes me as pretty interesting. I think the most obvious example of this, and maybe you were alluding to it, Neelan, is a Feast for Odin. I mean, in some ways, like the idea that you're playing a tribe, right? You're playing a tribe in Feast for Odin. And I've always liked the idea in Feast for Odin that you're like, okay, you can go through hunting, you can go through whaling, you can go through sort of an upgrading process, getting resources and upgrading them. You could go through breeding animals. And it feels like a comprehensive experience.
Right.
So far as like you can do, like, I'm going to try to win this game by going down the animal route. Be like, this is what our village is going to do. We're going to breed animals. We're going to be the best at that, and so on and so forth.
Exactly. I think it's something that like Uwe was like very focused on during the design of A Feast for Odin, which is what are all the things that Vikings did, and how do we incorporate that into this game, you know? And it does end up adding a lot of like complexity to that game, because like you can do this and you can do this and you can do this, and we haven't spoken about how you can do this, but like it does create a richness to the experience.
Yeah.
I'm not convinced that's different from just rules, but I understand the argument. And my second point or question is, if you can do anything that you want, aren't you just playing a role-playing game?
Yes. That is why I always play A Feast for Odin with my Viking helmet on.
Yeah, and take those deeply problematic actions that Uwe turned into a very cute farming simulator.
Exactly.
One sort of counter to that, the idea of the openness of a game, for example, like Feast for Odin, is the fact that it's always struck me that in games like this, if you're going to play it competitively, you really have to like really drill down one aspect. So it becomes much less sandboxy, much less like comprehensive, because if you're going to win via whaling, you really need to go hard into whaling. And so it becomes more of just like seeing the efficiency and running it down that path.
But isn't that criticism of Feast for Odin? If there are 70 paths and only like 4 golden paths a la Dune, and all the other paths are paths, and like the game is actually figuring out which paths suck, is that good?
Well, I think in defense of A Feast for Odin, there aren't that many paths that are unviable. I think it bore out in the original game that there are definitely paths that are less good than others, but I don't think that was certainly an intent of the design.
There's no one true golden path, huh?
Exactly.
You don't believe the prophet. All right, so let us get to brass tacks. Let us justify heaviness by talking about our philosophies on what needs to transpire in order to justify heaviness, and perhaps a game or two that highlight that in the best way possible. Who wants to start?
I'll go first. I mentioned earlier the quantity of rules and the edge cases and the mental load when it comes to learning rules can be one aspect of heaviness. And it's also, I think, of the different prongs of the fork we've talked about, sort of the one that is the most difficult hurdle for me, because I enjoy heavy games, I think, more than most. But one big drawback when it comes to it is if they have complicated rule sets, then it's going to be hard to remember the rules. It's going to be hard to teach the game. So that's a huge hurdle when it comes to games with big rule sets. And I think that a way to get around that is to make the rules sort of thematic with the game. And so I'm going to bring up a game that I haven't talked about a lot and sort of maybe a surprise, but Shipyard by Vladimir Suchy is a game with quite a few rules. It's also a game with quite a few rondels. It's the rondels on rondels. Like you'll activate one rondel to do something else, another rondel. And so there's a lot of stuff going on with it. But I think it's probably my favorite Suchy because I think that the way that all the rules are incorporated in the game make a lot of sense. In the game, you are building boats and you're like testing them out and you're acquiring the best rigging for the boat and the best crew and all this kind of stuff. And I just feel like the way the rules are presented and the way the game's laid out just really embrace the theme. You're building these boats out, and one of the considerations you have is how big of a boat do I want to build? Do I want to take time building a larger boat that's going to be able to score me more points, or do I want to just run out a bunch of smaller boats? And so despite the fact that there are a lot of rules and there's a lot of stuff going on, it's a quite brain burnery game, I find it really simple to internalize because of the way that the rules correspond with the theme. And so I've taught this game a couple times, and I always need to brush up on the rules a little bit, but the learning curve is much shorter than it would be for a similar game. Like a game that I'm thinking about that could be the opposing aspect. This would be one that I recently talked about, Vindication, which is not necessarily the heaviest of games, but we talked about, in talking about Vindication, how disjointed the rules and the theme feel, and how that even in our first couple games of it, it sort of hindered the learning experience because the rules seem to oppose the theme. So again, Shipyard, a game that's quite heavy, but the way that the rules integrate with the theme just makes it a game that I really enjoy, and I don't hesitate going back to even after playing it for a while. Whereas a lot of these games, a lot of heavy games, one of the things that makes me play less of them is just like that feeling like, oh man, I really like this game. I know I like it, but there's so many rules, and I'm going to have to really relearn the whole thing, and that's going to be sort of a drag. In short, I think Shipyard is a great example of a way to overcome that number of rules, that rules load, by making the thematic connection to the rules strong, so that when you're considering playing it, you're not hesitating because of having to relearn the whole thing, because you know that once you start, you might have to brush up on it a little bit, but the thematic connections will pull you along and make that burdensome experience not so much, because the strength of the thematic connection is so strong.
Yeah, I mentioned this last week, but that's the thing, like, ultimately that put me off something like a Mage Knight. Relearning that system every time I want to play Mage Knight, because the rules are just complex enough that I can't keep it in my head in the way that like, battles work and all the combat effects, that it is sometimes hard to justify that. But that would be a good example to me of, like, if I specifically wanted this experience, Mage Knight is, to allude to what I was saying earlier, Mage Knight is very much trying to replicate, like, Heroes of Might and Magic. So it's like, if you want Heroes of Might and Magic in a board game, boy, let me tell you about Mage Knight, but you really, really have to want to push past the rule set to get there. Then you compare that to a game where I will happily wax lyrical whenever I can, like Through the Ages, which absolutely justifies its complexity for strategic reasons. I feel like you're seeing the same impulse in Vlado, which is like, how do I recreate this video game I love in board game form faithfully? But one of them works incredibly well with me. I wanted this game, and one I think works very well, but not enough for like to have kept it in my collection. In the case of Mage Knight versus Through the Ages, but I have the opportunity to talk at length about Through the Ages once a year, so I will save you all from that for right now. But a game that I did want to talk about that I do think, now that we've accepted and now we've all agreed that these three prongs I mentioned earlier are exceedingly important, here's a game that does them all. So Forbidden Stars is a game that I think that has an incredibly rich strategic level to it. The way that the order system in Forbidden Stars plays out, for example, if you're not familiar, it happens in reverse order. So you put your order down onto the stack, and then your opposition can put their orders on top of that, and then they resolve in reverse order. So whoever played their order most recently resolves that first. And that adds a layer of complexity to like thinking about it. It's kind of unorthodox way to think about the way that orders typically process in a game, but it does add this very, very strategic depth to it that justifies it, which is that it kind of replicates the idea of like speed and response time. Like if I put an order down, I'm effectively saying, I'm going to do this thing at some point in the future. Here is your ability to react to it in real time, but your ability to react to it largely depends on what that is, and there's a little bit of like information futzing in there, which I think is just really, really clever, and I think a system that justifies its complexity. On top of that, I think Forbidden Stars is probably the only way that I've really ever enjoyed Warhammer, and specifically Warhammer 40k, in an experience that actually feels very authentic, very Warhammer-y, in that you're just sending armies across the galaxy to battle other armies, but in board game form. You know, like this kind of ties into the thing I was trying to get to at the end, where it's very hard to replicate something that feels appropriate thematically without this heavy of a rule set. It's the thing I've been struggling with Warhammer in general for a long time. The reason I keep trying to pick up Kill Team and Fire Team is because I want something that feels like Warhammer without the rule set, but at some point, you just have to tell yourself, like, no, if you want something that feels like Warhammer, you have to have the rule set there, because otherwise it will be cutting corners in a way that is cutting things that you like out of that style of game. And then on top of that, Forbidden Stars is just a very long experiential game with a lot of back and forth. You're building up armies, you're sending armies, you're having these big epic fights. It takes hours and hours to play. And I think that, to me, captures everything about this question to me. It's an experience that I couldn't have any other way, that is going to feel like no other experience within a very specific theme that I love. And in order to get there, it has to be a complex game. Like, I just don't think you could get there with a simpler rule set.
So it's like, I've played Forbidden Stars, right? I think Forbidden Stars is a great example of something that would be hard to replicate at a shorter length or at a shorter heaviness. But when I look at the deck building sort of and the length of combat, and even to me, like, I enjoy the decision making to an extent of, you know, if you want to be the last person to move, you have to commit to move first, which I believe is how it works. I haven't played it in a couple of years. But it feels like a puzzle that's getting in the way of an area control board game to some degree. For me, who's bad at planning out my turn that far in advance, let's say. I understand the strengths of it. So it's like, I don't know how you can justify that system beyond, like, it's a fun puzzle and I like Warhammer and I like this game. Do you know what I mean?
I think I know where you're coming from, and it's hard to respond with except to say that I disagree. Like, I think
what?
That I think that the puzzle, that is the thing that I think that you're butting heads with here, is very much creating the experience that I want out of that game. It's not enough to say that I want an area control game set in the Warhammer universe. Because here's the thing that movement system replicates, right? It's like, I see in the distance this massive fleet coming towards me. I've like launched my ships towards you from across the galaxy. I put that disc down, and now you have the ability to do what you can and respond to that. It creates a moment. It creates a moment that is so distinct from the puzzle of figuring through your order of your operations. You know, like, it's part and parcel of what that experience is to me. It's not a puzzle that gets in the way of the experience. It is the experience.
All right. You can't argue with passion. So I am going to jump in, and I tackled this a little bit like I wanted to find a game that, for me, represented heaviness in a way that felt super justified, both with sort of like my philosophical understandings of, for me, what makes a game justified to be heavy, and then sort of illustrate it through the game itself. And so that game for me is Food Chain Magnate. I think is such a quintessential example of a heavy game that for me justifies itself, and many heavy games don't. And so a couple of the reasons for that for me, and Food Chain Magnate, for those who don't know, is a splatter game where you are running a fast food empire. And the first thing for me is that the systems within the game need to be overlaid on top of each other and not separate. And so we have this dearth. Dearth is a lack of.
Yes.
We don't have a dearth. We have an overabundance, not a dearth, an anti-dearth of Euro games.
A dearth Vader, you might say.
Yes, a dearth Vader. That are just these like 16 mini games happening in different corners of the map. They're all scoring you points. There's not much where they touch upon each other, except that you have a limited amount of visits that you can go to each theme park attraction. And I won't name specific names because when I do, those proponents will come in and say, no, you don't understand Tekenyu, Kellen. It's actually not that. No, you don't understand Witchstone, Kellen. Great. I love Food Chain Magnate because everything is in the surface of the almighty dollar. Everything that you do in the game is about getting more inventory, right? Getting the right workers set, getting the right marketing campaign out into the game board in order to sell the most and get the most money and win the game. That makes it very harsh because if you aren't producing dollars, you are losing the game. But all of the systems, all of the deck building, all of the map awareness, spatial awareness that you're doing on the board are all in service of building towards the same thing, and I think it does it very lovingly. The second thing that I think justifies a heavy game is where the heaviness comes from an interdependence on what other players are doing as a result. And I think this is almost in super stark contrast to like a Neelan and a Feast for Odin, which is like almost like it doesn't matter what the other people are doing. And I know it's not that far, but it's fairly close. For me, a heavy game is only justified when the interdependence is on what other players are doing. And I think that Food Chain Magnate typifies this in such a great way with the milestones, which are achievements in the game that radically change each player's ability. So the first person to do something gets a power that's completely busted. Like, what do I do when Neelan is able to market for the rest of the game for free? It's insane. He does not have to pay any of his marketers. And that's going to fundamentally change what kind of food chain empire that I'm going to run. What do I do when Mark becomes the Burger King, right? He is making way more money than everybody else on burgers. So how do I respond to that? Do I cut him off at the knees and become better at providing cheaper and more burgers for everyone else? Or do I run away from the burger game because no one can beat the Burger King?
Home of the Whopper.
And then the last thing for me that justifies a heavy game is when the length, as in time units of the game, is justified by the dynamics of the game changing over time. So it is not a tedious experience because what you are doing is morphing along the game. And Food Chain Magnate, I believe, does this so well because you could actually score all of your points on the last 2 turns and still win the game, which some people, again, might find too harsh. But at the beginning of the game, you're struggling. You have no marketing. You have no product. You have no workers. And by the end of the game, you are running a crazy empire and doing this crazy deck building puzzle to make sure you can pay everybody and everyone can work for you in order to have that crazy payoff. And I find many games also fail at this, where what you're doing in the first third feels very similar to what you're doing in the last third. And I find that Food Chain Magnate does an amazing job as a heavy game to sort of buck that and really feel like there are distinct stages to this business that you are running.
I think that's a really strong argument for Food Chain Magnate and those types of games. The evolution of the game, as you're talking about, from like an early stage and morphing into like different stages of the game is a consideration I had not made when it came to justifying heaviness of a game. It almost, although there's not like discrete sections like you were saying with a game like Tekken, where there's like mini games here and there, it almost does feel like it's a way of like breaking up the game into different aspects where you're sort of ramping up and then you're running the engine, or you're doing your main thing and then you're exploiting at the end.
Mark prefers his phases to be clearly labeled, 1 phase and then 2 phase.
Right, exactly.
He's a 2-phase man.
I like to keep my phases separate.
I do think there's an asterisk on Food Chain Magnate, which is that the length of the game, you could be out in the first half hour of the game.
Sure.
Which is a knock against its heaviness for me. Like, in some ways, it's not justifying itself to be a 3-hour experience if someone is out in hour 1. And I have a hard time grappling with that, which is why I almost always just play this with people around my relative skill level.
Yeah.
Because I know I would be punked into the next existence by a superstar like Brandon, the amazing Bausack / Whitehall Mysteries player.
I actually think in general that is the single biggest issue that complicates all of this for me, right? Is that if you are playing a long, heavy game and someone is clearly having a bad time, then that is an even harder situation to extricate yourself from. Like, Forbidden Stars can be guilty of this, especially as a 2-player game. That has a very, okay, I'm either dominating the map or I'm not. And if you are in a losing position and you still have 2 hours left of the game, I don't know that there is any better solution than just to be okay with conceding. But some games afford that more gracefully than others.
Yeah, and that can be, to sort of harp on the point, the biggest issue with heavy games. I think heavy games, when you're playing with them with people who are more experienced, can be some of the worst experiences I've had in board games, or the most like grueling is probably a better term. Although the alternative, like playing a heavy game over and over again with the same group where you're relatively growing in experience, can be some of the best
for sure
experiences, because a well-designed heavy game where you get a lot of choices, there's a big decision space, I think can be really fun to play around in with people who are sort of learning at your level and are not going to be dominating you and making the game unfun early on.
I mean, hey, that was my exact experience with another Splotter game, The Great Zimbabwe. Like, I've mentioned this before, but I played that game for the first time with people that were more familiar with it and had a bad time. And I found a group of people in our Discord to play the game with repeatedly and grow and learn together, and it's now in my top 50. That is, I think, the hardest part and the biggest reward of more complex games, is being willing to like put up with the dark times to get to the richness on the other end.
I agree with that. Yeah. The heavy games, when done well and when they're done in the right experience, can bloom into a bigger thing. Whereas I think sometimes lighter games, not always, because certainly there are light games who have such refined rule sets and such refined game systems that they can be fun repeatedly. But a lot of times with lighter games, you feel like after a play or two, you sort of got it, and there's not really much room for more exploration.
So are we aligned on heaviness here? Are we aligned on what justifies it? I don't think we are. I think, what?
I don't think we are either. I don't think we necessarily are.
We never have been.
Well, we couldn't even agree on 3 prongs to this fork, so...
Yeah, I know. Can't even agree on kitchen utensils.
Well, okay, let's set the record straight. Mark's fork has 2 prongs, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
I added a third, right, and perfected the American fork.
Right, and then I took your 3-fork design and said, like, you know what, this prong, not exactly the right length, would be better if it was, like, slightly this way inclined, and, you know...
Right. Made it a lot more... one could say nebulous and unclear.
I added a notch into one of the prongs of the fork, and now it's a cake fork, and everyone loves cake.
All right. That is going to do it for this episode of the Board Game Barrage podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for hanging out with us in the Discord, which you can reach at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. You can find us on all forms of social media. You can email us at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter, where Neelan is ramping up the shenanigans with his tweets. He's making jokes now. He's a comedian on that. And you can find us on Instagram, where we occasionally post pretty pictures of board games at instagram.com/boardgamebarrage. Thank you to Heart Society Music for their intro and outro song, What's on Your Mind, Kid? And that is going to do it. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Oh, sorry, before I get... Mark, do you mind just saying like a couple of sentences into the mic? There was like something I was picking up on in the last episode that I just wanted to see if like it's coming through your mic or just something else weird. Yeah.
Okay.
Just keep talking at me for a bit.
Yeah. This is testing. Let me pull something up to say on the thing.
And especially like when you got louder as well.
Okay, so you mean to speak loudly?
Yeah, it was like a partial like clipping, but not really clipping. Just kind of like as you would get loud, there would just be like a little futzing that was sort of noticeable, like a crit.
Castles of Burgundy is a legendary board game design created by Stefan Feld. In this 1 to 4 player tabletop experience, you will take on the role of what?
Get loud.
You will take on the role of an aristocrat controlling a small princedom, trying to build a settlement with powerful castles, practice trades, exploit silver mines, and use knowledge of travelers.
I don't think so. That's a weird sentence.
Reading board game descriptions with gusto feels like a very viable like TikTok strategy.
It's really true.
All right, we're going to 3-2.